We are recording this podcast on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We wish to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend our respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening.
Hello and welcome to Novel Feelings, where two psychologists take a deep dive into your favorite books. I'm Priscilla.
And I'm Elise. Today we have an author interview with Alice Robinson, and we'll be talking about her new book, If You Go. More about that in a sec.
We've been doing a lot of thinking and planning here at the HQ, which is not really, it's not a literal HQ, but just in our brains.
What do you mean we don't have a big fancy studio with all of our staff and social media managers and audio engineers and so on? No, Novel Feelings HQ is us. It's just us.
Yes.
But yeah, essentially we are in a big reflective thinking period at the moment, and we're kind of trying to gauge interest from our audience, from you guys, about whether we should do a season 4 of book reviews or not. If we do season 4, we definitely want to make it like a book club again. So announcing books in advance, giving everyone a couple of months to read along, having discussion questions, spoilers and non-spoiler sections for those that haven't read the book yet, all the same kinds of things we did in season 3. But we are really interested in having more community engagement and having a discussion group, whatever that format might look like. We're also thinking about things like subscription tiers, and if that might be a viable option for us, just to try to cover some of the base costs involved in running a podcast like this. So at the moment, we're really just trying to collect feedback and thoughts from our audience.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than thinking you're doing great work, but you're actually shouting into the void. So it would be good to just hear from you guys about what you've enjoyed or what could be better, what we could do differently next time.
Absolutely. And at this stage, there's no wrong way to provide feedback. So we've got lots of options for doing that. So you can comment on our Instagram posts or send us a direct message on Instagram. You can comment on our latest blog post. We do have a blog post which is all about the sort of history of Novel Feelings and our thoughts about the future. So leave us a comment there. We also have a feedback survey, which is completely anonymous, no sign up required. So go to novelfeelings.com/feedback if you prefer to give us your thoughts that way. I don't know, there's just, we have an email address. You can email us if you want to. Maybe if you have really negative feedback, don't put a review on Apple Podcasts. That would be preferable to not get feedback about improving that way. But if you love us, please do. Please give us a review. But yeah, we just want to know your thoughts. So if you have burning ideas, now is the time to let us know. So please do that, and that will directly inform our decisions about what we do in 2025.
To what we're here for today. So today we have an interview with Alice Robinson, author of If You Go, which is a speculative fiction, partly.
Yeah, I'd say speculative fiction, which was just released in June 2024. Alice Robinson is the author of 2 previous novels, Anchor Point and The Glad Shout. In 2012, Alice earned a PhD by Research and Creative Writing at Victoria University, for which she was awarded the Vice-Chancellor's Peak Award. Alice lives in Melbourne with her kids and works at Federation University and RMIT.
Here's the synopsis for If You Go. When Esther wakes with a breathing tube down her throat, she has no idea where she is or how she got there. In terrible physical condition, Esther is tended to by Grace, the only other person in the building. In the half-consciousness of her recovery, Esther is desperate to get back to her young kids and grapples with the events of her life as they come flooding back. A childhood spent between warring parents, the demise of her marriage, the struggles she faced when her children were born. Suspicious of Grace, Esther takes drastic action to escape. But there are certain facts about the reality of her situation, her place in time, her history, and her life that she will need to uncover first. Thank you to Affirm Press for linking us together.
And before we get started with our interview, our usual disclaimers. So, of course, we're trained psychologists, but please don't take this as therapeutic advice. Consult a professional for more specific and tailored advice. And our interview is split into 2 sections, non-spoilers first, followed by spoilers.
For some content notes today, we are talking about topics such as grief, motherhood, and intergenerational trauma, as well as some suicidal themes.
All right, let's get started on our interview with Alice Robinson.
Welcome, Alice, to Novel Feelings. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so lovely.
Yeah, and congratulations on the publication of If You Go in June. This is your third book. Are there certain themes that you keep going back to or getting drawn into in your writing?
Oh, definitely. So the three books in my mind, they're actually a kind of an informal trilogy, although they're completely different in their plots and narratives and characters, but they're thematically very connected. And I've always kind of known that. I knew that from the first book that for some reason I had a sense that there would be three. And the thing that kind of differentiates them apart from their particular stories is that Anchor Point, the first novel, ended in about 2018, which was a little bit speculative at the time because it was published in 2015. The Glad Shouts maybe set, in my mind, perhaps a 50 years on into the future. And If You Go, without giving away too many spoilers, deals with a greater span of time. So they're kind of leaping forward speculatively.
Wow.
In terms of the thematic concerns, they all deal with this same kind of question, which is, can we be the architects of our own destiny, or to what extent can humans chart the course of their lives? And to what extent are we also subject to grand narratives like intergenerational trauma, which I'm sure we'll all talk about, or forces like climate change or environmental destruction that are sort of coming in to impose upon the characters' individual lives, while they themselves are trying to make sets of decisions for themselves. So those two things are in kind of conflict in each of the books around, what the character's agency and these outside forces that are controlling them to some extent.
And is that a conscious choice for you? Did you sort of go out planning, this loose trilogy and these interwoven themes, or is that just how things naturally unfolded?
It's unfortunately, it's how they naturally unfolded. And I only say unfortunately because I think it speaks to, it's a bit revealing. Like if you could intellectualize those themes and think, I'm going to write 3 books that deal with these themes, there's sort of something very clinical about that. And the truth is that I wrote those books because of something about who I am as a person, I think. Those are the concerns that interest me. And so you feel that you've told a secret or something about yourself when you've published these 3 works that are all this sort of similar. Yeah, I love this idea that Jonathan Franzen has of hot material. I'm sure it's been attributed to Franzen, and he sort of has this idea that every writer has hot material, and that's the thing that they'll keep returning to in spite of themselves because of who they are, because of their unique selves and psychologies. And so I guess mine is those themes that I talked about in each book. There's, difficult or challenging or interesting to me relationships between mothers and children. So those are some of the, my hot material.
And I'm sure that much of that hot material is going to be covered as we progress with this interview. But thinking about your most recent publication, of course, If You Go, which is the focus of today. So that novel is told in both flashbacks and present day scenes. Present day Esther is very confused and fearful, struggling to understand her surroundings. So how did you balance the present and the past in this book, writing scenes where we've got this very confused protagonist and, flashing back and so on, particularly in the first half of the book before we sort of, as an audience, learn what is actually happening and what gaps, filling those gaps in their timeline?
The book started out being a very realist novel. So at first, well, the parts that came first were the parts about Esther's sort of formative life, her life with her children, her life in the marriage and with her parents. So the novel covers Esther's life, as you would know, from, her earliest childhood to her adulthood in one kind of timeline. And as you're implying, there's another kind of facet, a speculative facet to the novel. And those speculative elements are kind of interspersed with or framing the memories of her life, if you like. And so I felt actually that I could have just written about Esther's everyday life because the speculative parts are much harder to write.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think because you're having to really bring to the forefront and harness and master your full imagination to make something up that's never existed, like the facility where Esther wakes up. It just felt like really hard labor, whereas Esther's known life is sort of more like our contemporary lives. So it's sort of, there was more material to draw in the world.
Fascinating. And of course, If You Go is largely themed around grief, especially Esther's grief for her old life and what could have been. How did you approach writing about Esther's unique brand of grief compared to how it is normally or usually depicted in literature?
I think, this book came out of the pandemic, and it came out of a time when in my life where my life had really changed just on the cusp of the pandemic. My marriage ended as well, which is also part of Esther's plot point, although our trajectories are quite different in many ways. But that key detail is, the same for both of us. And so there was something about, having a huge shift in my life and then going into the lockdown of the pandemic that I think made my own grief and my own emotional state sort of very resonant in a way that it perhaps wouldn't have been if I just plowed on through my life. But that I think we all felt to some extent that the pandemic came along and sent us home to our bedrooms to think about, what we'd done, everything that had happened. And so that I can see in the structure of the novel that in some way I was enacting that idea on the page, that Esther's, sort of been frozen in time, if you like. And when she finds herself in that facility, she's forced to reckon with everything that's predated that moment. And so I could see that that's how, it came about. I'm not sure about whether the quality of the grief that I'm describing was something that I kind of intellectualized, or perhaps it was just trying to evoke to say something that I knew to be true, the most true thing I could say about that, which is this kind of, for Esther, there's a real anxiety about separation from from her two children, and a worry, and at least initially, about where they are. And I think I really feel that too, this sense that that for children, being separated from a parent is probably the dominant fear of childhood, or at least probably was for me. And likewise, for a parent to not know where your children is sort of like a primary anxiety. So that's where her grief kind of begins. It's sort of a fretting, I think. And then it unfolds as she starts to work out what's really happened to her.
That panic sort of evolves into more of a very deep sadness, and without spoiling things, of course.
Yeah.
It's a grief for what could have been rather than a grief for, what has been lost in more of a typical chronological sense that a lot of us might experience grief.
Yes.
We had a quote that was highlighted, the poem by Maggie Smith at the beginning of the book, which has the line, "If you go, you have to stay gone." How do you feel that might apply to Esther's story?
Interesting. So Maggie Smith's poem is relating, it's describing her divorce. I think it's something like, after the divorce, I think of something my daughter said about Mars. If, basically it's like, if you go, you have to stay gone. And so there is something about that what to me Maggie Smith is evoking in that poem is a sense of like, one door closes behind you and it stays closed as you make decisions in your life. Our lives are lived in a linear fashion. We're born, we go through the stages of growth, and we die. And Esther's story disrupts that narrative in some way. She has a chance to not stay gone. And so by disrupting that, the linearity of her life, there's a chance for her to have a great gift, which is that she gets more time. It's very hard to talk about without spoiling it. So she gets more time, but in some ways, I guess the question that I was asking in myself about that, and why that Maggie Smith's poem is sort of resonant about, do you have to stay gone? And if you don't, what does that mean? So when I came to the novel, I was thinking, sort of like, is it worth being anywhere in the world without the people and the places and, the life that you love most and know most? Is our one wild and precious life, or our mortality, valuable at any cost, or is it only really worth living like that if you've got the people around you?
Yeah. It also made me think about motherhood or parenthood in general, and that, once you've made that choice, you can't exactly go back.
That's so true.
Yeah. And so I'm thinking about Esther's mother, for example. It seems like, it's hard to talk about her as well without diving into the details, but it feels like she wanted to be two things that might not in her mind align or can exist together. But she's made the choice to be a mother, and she's trying to do that while also upholding her other values. But yeah, there seems to be a lot of
things don't quite mesh
yeah.
for her, do they? I mean,
yeah.
her views on feminism and motherhood lead to so many difficulties in a relationship with Esther. And as you've mentioned, Alice, motherhood is such a strong theme throughout this story. You know, we're both feminists. We're both considering parenthood down the track and found this really intriguing. So can you comment on why you decided to explore this theme of motherhood?
I guess partly because I am a mother and it's interesting to me. You know, it's a sort of in our culture, mothers are seen, I think, to be, you know, well, we're fairly invisible. If you are visible, then you're sort of being annoying or embarrassing. You know, you're sort of stripped of many of the things that make women have the potential to make women powerful in the culture, like sex appeal, for example. As soon as you have a baby, but my lived experience is that, you know, mothers are so brave. There's such a huge amount of courage required to, like, say goodbye to your partner when they go off to work, for example, if you're in the stage where you've got really little babies, and then face a whole day or 12 hours or whatever it is alone with little kids. There's a sort of a certain kind of tenacity required for that. And I observed that in the early stages of my parenthood, where I thought these women are really amazing. You know, they're really doing something very complex that the culture really doesn't recognize or value very much. And I think in terms of Esther's mother, you know, she was a character that I really enjoyed writing a lot. I found, you know, some readers have sort of suggested that the book's quite bleak, and I can see that. But Esther's mother to me was quite funny. You know, she had a lot of great one-liners, or, you know,
Definitely.
I really enjoyed her a lot. She's sort of a little bit of a Germaine Greer kind of public feminist, with quite a bit of success in her work. And one of the kind of characteristics of Esther's childhood is that her mother leaves to pursue her work, which we could see as a kind of an abandonment or a complexity that has a negative impact on Esther. And I think it certainly does. But I also think the mother, Vivian, is also, she says later, you know, your father was the one with the family house. So she sends Esther to live with the father. And I see that as still an extension of her version of caretaking. She's still trying to be a good parent, just that it looks different from the expected route.
Yeah, I love that introduction to Vivian, where Esther has that memory of being suffocated accidentally while playing, and then she goes to Vivian, and something about being picked up like she was an old coat and kind of just put on her lap, while Vivian just kept talking to her friends. And I was like, that's such a beautiful imagery. Yeah.
Thank you. There's something, as you're saying that, I'm just thinking for the first time, you know, Esther's childhood with her mother before she goes to live with her father, by virtue of that description, is sort of, she's very much in an adult world with Vivian as a little kid. She doesn't have the kind of mother who's pandering to her and putting her at the center of her life. And I'm just thinking now, perhaps that's actually a great gift for some children, you know, to be absorbed into the adult world. But I know that Esther in the book really longs for the type of mother who would center her. Even though, so it's just interesting. She's sort of, Vivian's very much on her own path. She's not going to be standing around making jam sandwiches after school or anything like that.
Yeah, and I think that certainly, you know, a lot of mothers are a combination of both, where they don't pander to their children, but they can also recognize the distress that their child might be feeling in any moment and address that. But I think it feels to me, and I might be wrong because you're the writer, so you can tell me, but that scene feels like maybe Vivian wasn't quite reaching that balance in that moment, or at least in Esther's perspective anyway. And that becomes, to Vivian, it was probably not a significant moment, but to Esther, that was quite a defining memory.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think so there was a lot of material from Esther's life to choose from for the book. I probably had another 80,000 words or so of scenes from Esther's life that never made it. The balance was kind of off with the speculative and realist. And as I say, I felt I could keep writing those scenes forever. So in the end, you're trying to pick out the moments that maybe tell the story of Esther's life, that are not repetitive, so that we don't need lots and lots from every part of her life. And that formative memory, the moment that predates Esther's mother picking her up like an old coat or putting her down like an old coat, where she's being smothered, I remember that from my own childhood. So that's one that really came from my life as a little kid, where some kids put a beanbag or some pillows over my face and I was too little to push them off. A sense of suffocation. Yeah, those visceral embodied memories sort of you do hold on to them all your life.
It must be such a challenge to pick out those resonant moments from your writing when you've got so much content to choose from, and it sounds like so much of it had that personal touch as well. What was that process like of that editing down and the tough decisions to decide what to include in the book?
Part of it was about ensuring, to the best of my ability, that the characters felt balanced. So I didn't want there to be a sense that Vivian or Esther herself or her father or any of the characters, or Jean-Paul, her ex-husband, that any of them were the bad guy in the story. I wanted to try and give a kind of a balanced perception of all of them. So that was part of my thinking into picking and choosing, so that there was a kind of, we got different visions or different views of these different people. But also part of it was sort of about trying to tell the story without having, being too heavy-handed. So eliciting, some light moments as well, because the moments in the bunker are a little bit fraught for Esther. I'm calling it a bunker. I think in the book I call it a facility. The moments that we remember, and I'm sure that you both, because of the nature of your work, understand this better than me. I reckon the moments that we remember from our histories are often moments where something went wrong, where we felt overlooked or wounded in some way, or someone said the wrong thing that, you take it to heart and sort of shocks you in some way, it sticks in your mind. So that posed a little bit of a structural problem for the book, in that the parts in the facility were going to be difficult for Esther, and then I was probably going to be telling, if I'm really picking out the parts of her life that resonate with her, they're going to be also the difficult moments. And so trying to find some of those moments where they're also funny interjections. There's a lovely moment where one of the children, she observes what her children's speaking, and they say, one of them says to the other, "Don't worry, moths are just the bad guys of butterflies." And, so some lovely moments like that, just to kind of lift the grimness was important, I think.
I think I really want to dive into some spoilers, to be honest. So I think we might come to the end of our non-spoiler section now, but we do want to ask one final question, just in case anybody's about to turn off and go and read the book and then come back. But a question that we ask everybody who we interview, which is, do you have any book or author recommendations that you'd like to share with our listeners, aside from your own body of work, of course?
I would love to share a book that I consider one of the most beautiful novels, which is The Winter Vault by Anne Michaels. It's a book I return to very often. Anne Michaels is a Canadian poet, but she's written 3 novels now. Each one takes about 10 or 12 years for her to write, which I think speaks to the beauty of their construction and their language. And The Winter Vault was the second novel. I just think it's so beautiful, and she does things with language because of her poetry that's really remarkable. So that's a book that I would recommend, that also deals with these intergenerational concepts with time, with inheritances and so on. And I also I don't think this book needs any extra readers because it's been so popular, but I did really enjoy Miranda July's new book, All Fours, which is, in a way, I feel like If You Go is a little bit of like a grief-soaked cousin of that book, because it's sort of dealing with the same issues, but it's very funny. So I would really recommend that book as well.
Brilliant.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Well, I think that's the end of our non-spoiler section. If you haven't read the book yet, please go ahead and read the book and then come back.
All right, let's dive into our spoilers, as I feel like we've been dancing around some of these naturally. Let's start with some speculation, or some of the speculative elements, of course, of If You Go. So as the novel progresses, the audience is able to fill in the gaps around the time jump. Esther's cryogenic, I just realised I don't know how to say that word. Cryogenic freezing. Yep. And why she awoke 100 years later. Can you talk us through your vision for what the world looks like in 100 years' time, and how much of this was prediction versus a more sort of dystopian view of the future?
Interesting. I didn't know anything about the world, and actually I tried to avoid, I think, ever evoking the outside world because it's more work. So you've got enough on your plate when you're trying to write a novel. At first, actually, so backing up, the first thing I knew about what had happened to Esther, of course, I was interested in cryogenic freezing, and I had a vision, or I had the kind of the scene in mind where she wakes up, and that was the limit of my kind of understanding, and I had to kind of build it from there. But I didn't even, so when she wakes up, she's in the facility with one other person, an older woman called Grace, who's about, the age her grandmother might be. She's about 70 or so maybe more like her mother. So I originally thought that maybe even Grace wouldn't be part of the facility, or I was thinking like it would be better if it would be less work if Esther was alone. But then I thought I kind of worked out. I tried to write those scenes, so maybe she's just in the facility and it can talk to her, or but you think this is going to be like that Tom Hanks film with the volleyball, she'll just be talking to herself the whole time. And you think, okay, I'll have to put another character in there. But I didn't know the nature of their relationship, which is one of the big reveals in the book. So that only came about because first the character was there and then they're interacting. And then over a number of months or years, I suddenly think, what is their relationship? And it's, so there's revelations that are occurring for the writer in that sense as you go along as well. And certainly that's the case for the outside world. Eventually they, I had to have them going outside. It felt like the right choice. And then I had to invent that future. I was a little bit reluctant I'd written a lot about speculative futures in the previous book, in The Glad Shout, which is about a storm destroying Melbourne. So I didn't really have another completely invented future to draw on, but my work for the last 10 years has been about climate change. So in terms of going back to your original question of is it invention or is it dystopia, or is it prediction? I think it's not that hard to trace things forward given the swathe of information that we have. And of course, the kind of futures that I've evoked in my work are futures that all of us hope never come to pass. None of us want those outcomes. But the people do often say that they feel prescient. And I think that's because it doesn't take a great leap of imagination to conjure something like that in an imagined future, given the state of the world now. So it's probably a little bit of both.
Well, I have this tendency to watch a lot of like American crime murder show like Bones and Castle and things. So cryogenics is not surprising because all these shows seem to have at least one episode about someone getting frozen. Yeah.
See, all my knowledge of cryogenics is from Futurama, which is not exactly accurate in any sense. So this is perhaps a more thought-provoking depiction of such a future.
Yeah. So, what sort of research was involved for you regarding the technology of cryogenics?
There is, weirdly, at the time I was writing the book, the first facility for cryogenics was being built and has now opened. It opened like almost at the same time as the book was published. And I believe someone's already been frozen. It's in Holbrook. And the thing that interested me about that, so I had a kind of decision to make as I was writing the book, and I knew this place was being built, about whether I would go and have a look. And when I looked at it online, it was one thing that I loved about it was that it just looks like a big shed. It doesn't look all fancy and schmick or like techie. It looks like a shed on someone's farm, and that really delighted me. So my facility is also quite daggy. It's not, not very slick either. But I decided not to go, and because I thought, I always come back to this idea of, I'm a fiction writer. Like I can make up whatever I like. So I did do some research about how cryogenics really works and what types of people usually go for it and how they preserve the bodies and so on. And then I just gave myself license to deviate from that and invent my own technology and my own processes that fit with my book, because it's one of the great perks of the job.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're not writing a non-fiction
That's right.
textbook about this, are you? It's more in the bigger service of the human story that you're telling, right? It doesn't have to be accurate all the time.
No, and I'm sure that there will be real diehard sci-fi fans or indeed scientists who are saying, who might read the book and think that can never happen, and that it only has to have enough logic within the structure of the narrative for a reader to go with you, I think. I'm not expecting anyone to take these as blueprints for their own facility.
So we would love to chat about Esther's relationship with her ex-husband at this stage, John Paul. Can you reflect on their relationship and what contributed to its breakdown?
Yeah, I am confused about that myself. And in a way, part of the writing of the book was to work this out. What went wrong between these two people? So there's, we can surmise a few, potential reasons. One of the reasons that I think is sort of implicitly in the book is related to this kind of sense of intergenerational marriage breakdown. So Esther's parents were together and then they separated and her father repartnered. So she had an experience of this kind of family dynamic herself. And then she's, both sort of, there's a sense of rightness about it, I think, almost when it happens to her, and also a sense of sort of horror that it's happened to her and that she's enacting the same fate on her own children. And there's a line where one of the children says something like, just about everyone gets divorced after a while, so this sort of, Esther feels this great sort of sense of grief that she's provided an intergenerational precedent for this type of marriage breakdown that her children now accept as normal.
Is this fate?
Yeah.
Is this inevitable?
Yeah, it's going to happen. It's coming for you. So, so that's sort of perhaps one of the reasons we could draw on. I think something became very clear to me in the book when I read. It's a sort of a weird thing to say, but probably 4 years into the writing of the book, I picked up this really new biography of Sylvia Plath, and I loved it. It's over 1,000 pages long, and I read the whole thing. And I really loved it, and I just suddenly thought it felt very uncanny because Plath's story is very similar to Esther's in many of the plot points. And, Ted Hughes and Plath bought a big house in the country, which Esther and Jean-Paul also do. They moved out there and had 2 kids in quick succession. Things get difficult. They separate and come back to their apartments in the city, which is basically the same trajectory for Esther and Jean-Paul. So that gave me a lot of comfort, only in the sense that I'm thinking, I'm working with this narrative and thinking, what went wrong between these people? And then a real example of this turns up in Plath's life. So it just gave me a sense of, there's something about that trajectory that's difficult. And if there's a real world template for it, then it sort of gave me the confidence to persevere with it for Esther, in spite of not really having that answer. It's not an intellectual thing. It was a sort of working by feel. I think Jean-Paul is a very kind man, and he's a good father. He's sort of lovely. But there's something in Esther, and that's the thing that I'm not sure about, that makes sort of being in the world and loving and assuming the roles that she thinks she should take on complex. She's always sort of uncomfortable in all the situations, it seems to me. And she also harbors this part of the complexity between her and Jean-Paul is the complexity around her ambition, which is to be a poet, even though in her lifetime she's getting no joy there at all. But she's always wanting to kind of pursue it and feels hamstrung. So last thing I'll say about that is that she set up a life with the little kids in the country and with Jean-Paul, that's very domestic. It's almost in my mind, a real pushback against the feminism of her mother. She's determined to do the right thing, to have the picket fence and the Kunara, and you're probably making her own bread, or that's how I imagined that part of her life. But she can't maintain it, because it's not sort of really her real essence. She really wants to be an artist.
Not getting that full fulfillment out of it that perhaps she had expected as well. Yeah.
Like, our first glimpse of their dynamic, or what you're talking about, I feel, is that scene of Esther staying up with, I think it was Claire, their newborn, and John Paul was asleep with earplugs on. And I was like, oh, but also Esther was saying, but that she was encouraging that at the same time. And so it's like she was playing into that, the gender roles that were happening in their marriage, rather than having a proper conversation with John Paul about how they make her feel. Yeah, so that conflict that you're talking about really came through, I think, in the book.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that. I really didn't want there to be a narrative where it was like things went wrong because of gender, or things went wrong because of Jean Paul.
Mm.
You know, and that part of that insight was only really possible in a very clear way for me because the book took 5 years to write. So you're thinking it would be very easy to say this is a story about a man and a woman where things went wrong because of who they were in that respect. And actually what I came to feel more and more as I wrote was they went wrong not because of who Jean Paul was or how they were even in a dynamic together, but really because of something innate in Esther. Like the earplugs is such a small but sort of poignant evocation of that idea.
Absolutely. And I think another one that was interesting that speaks to that inner conflict for Esther probably is towards the end, where she said something about how divorce seems like the feminist thing to do, that she was taking charge of her life, but she was unhappy. And clearly, you know, there was the financial aspect of it as well. And she wasn't fully happy on her own either. Yeah.
She took herself with her wherever she went. She was there, you know, that sort of quintessential horror. Yeah, I think she has, you know, she strives, that's for sure. You know, she's trying to first setting up this very, you know, nuclear family kind of ideal in the country, and then taking charge of things, as you say, to go off on her own. But at each stage, she's sort of, she's a bit naive or limited in her capacity in some way, I think. So she's floundering. And perhaps like her mother, that, you know, she would have been better off just doing something else, doing her own work, or I'm not sure.
Go into therapy.
Yes.
Well, I don't know if, you know, being married to a psychiatrist might put you off therapy. I did. One moment that definitely stood out to me was I didn't write down this quote, so I'm going to butcher it. Apologies, but the moment where Jean Paul says something to her along the lines of, you know, I work long hours because I'm literally saving lives, and I could see why Esther might develop some negative comparisons to him, and, you know, feeling, you know, we've already got a sense of her not having that fulfillment, or not having that deep happiness that, you know, perhaps would be desirable, and seeing, you know, maybe feeling inferior to Jean Paul at times. And I don't know, it sort of adds to this complex picture of why, you know, perhaps there was something not meshing in their relationship that was not so healthy in the long term.
He's sort of living out he's got this very meaningful work, but it also takes him out of the family, which I think he's finding hard. Yeah.
Just imagining saying to my husband, I work long hours because I'm saving lives.
You can save that one up and roll it out when as needed.
Well, this is, of course, building into the themes of motherhood and, you know, it's almost intergenerational trauma aspect to the work too. So, you know, we touched in the non-spoiler section on Esther and Vivienne's relationship. But there seems to be this pattern over time of this intergenerational trauma that their mothers are experiencing across the 3 generations. So from Vivienne's relationship with her own mother to Esther and Claire's, you can sort of see these relationship challenges playing out over time. In your view, how did Esther's relationship with her mother inform her own parenting and perhaps her perspective around motherhood?
I think she tries very hard to be a very different type of mother to the mother that she received. And she did have other templates in her father and stepmother as well, who are not complete, you know, not binary with Vivienne. They have their own complexities as well. I think Esther comes to kind of sort of an insight about her mother. There's a kind of a revelation of the type of mother that Vivienne had in Lorna, her name is, who had her own traumas that were passed down or that were enacted upon Vivienne, and that that makes sense to Esther. And that's a kind of one of the keys of the story for Esther's kind of reckoning, I guess, that she, gains insight into why her mother is the way that she is. And in terms of her, how she then parents, I think she holds herself to a high standard. But one of the kind of interesting things to me, about the way that the novel unfolds is that we have these sort of three generations. We've got Lorna, Vivian, and then Esther. And then we have Claire and Grace, who follow on, if that's not too spoilery. So
we're full in spoilers now. It's fine.
So we learn that Grace is Esther's granddaughter, is the kind of the punchline there, and that she's been hanging around the facility for many decades to wait for Esther's moment to wake up. And so I really thought it was important for Esther to be in the center, I guess, of this kind of chain of women, so that it wasn't a story about sort of mother blame. It wasn't a story where the blame all flowed backwards through the generations. But we also, there is perhaps a bit of that with some understanding, as I've said, but it also can flow forward because we get to see the outcome through Grace, of Esther's own parenting. And, it's not, Grace doesn't have a great time with Esther's child, Claire. And so one of the questions I was asking myself as I was writing in that capacity is, what would you say to the person who raised the person who messed you up as a kid? So if you had a chance, most of us don't reach adulthood with grandparents, so you never have a chance to have a big reckoning with your grandmother about the way that she raised your mother, for example, usually, and it's sort of too late by the time you might have these thoughts like, what would I say? So that was sort of one of the delights of the time frame in this novel, that the granddaughter and the grandmother, who are sort of, their ages are skewed according to normal linearity, but they can have that reckoning together.
Yeah, it makes me think of that. I can't remember the exact poem, but about how parenting always means messing your child up, and you don't really have a choice in the matter. It will just happen. And the only way to not do it is to opt out of parenting. So,
I think you're talking about Philip Larkin's wonderful poem about that.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. That's correct.
Yeah. But I think, you mentioned earlier that you don't want anyone to be a bad guy. And I think Vivian's complexity becomes more and more clear as we go on in the story. And this quote from Esther's dad was particularly striking to me. Your mother's politics made it difficult for her to love me. It was like every time I left dishes in the sink or was late home from work or had dry washing on the line, I was forcing her to reconsider hundreds and thousands of years of women's oppression. She acted like it was her civic duty to leave me. And this was followed by Esther thinking, what about me? Yeah. So I thought that was it was a beautiful line. And it made me think about, all these conversations women who have male partners probably have about mental load. Like, yeah.
Thank you. I'm thinking, as we're talking about this as well, about this idea I had as well as I was writing, related to, it's sort of a fear, and I think it's sort of evoked in the book, that we can step very carefully as parents to try and do our best. And most of doing our best relates to trying to protect the children and raise them to the best of our ability so they can go on and have happy lives. But in reality, and again, I think you probably both know lots about this from your work, I think probably often it's us, the parents, who usher in the greatest wounds for the children. Yeah. It's not the outside world at all. And in a way, you're kind of lucky, I guess, if that's the case, because it means no other external disasters have occurred in the life. But that's such a kind of a complex thing to kind of own as a parent. You go to all these extreme lengths, and in the end, it will be me.
I'm harking back to what you were talking about earlier about how these, we have these moments of deep clarity or, very strong memories about our childhoods, often those negative ones, which feel so formative to us, but a parent might not even realize that that was, something that you might have held on to over the years or shaped part of you or contributed towards a belief you might have about yourself or the world. So it's we all do our best and we just cannot avoid these moments happening, unfortunately. It's just such a complex way to look at how we shape the next generation, how we shape our children, I think.
One nice thing that arose out of the book in that way was that a reader said to me, I really love the book and it's made me reconsider the small moments that I have with my child. And that made me think, well, that's a really positive way of thinking about it. I think if you're aware that you are having an impact and that time only goes in one way in most of our lives and that, children grow up, then if you can kind of stay centered in the present because of those factors, it's a lovely way to think about a relationship with a child, I think.
Yeah. And I think what you said about how Grace and Esther can have their moment of reckoning together about this intergenerational trauma, for lack of a better word, I think that's lovely because, yes, I think parents always leave some sort of wound or impact on their children, but I guess the good ones, I suppose, also have those moments of repair and recognition and I guess apology as well if that was needed. And so the child's not left carrying this wound forever. It does heal over time.
Yeah, that's really lovely, and I think that was something that some readers have suggested that it's as I said that there's a bleakness to the book, but to me it was a hopeful ending. Not without sadness, but I think that in that reckoning or repair between Grace and Esther, it's sort of repairing many generations in some sense because Grace stays. Grace stays where Vivian leaves Esther as a child. Grace stays to caretake for her in sort of a mother by proxy in that facility. And she recognizes that. And it's very healing to Esther in that moment. So I think you're right. Repair's always possible even 100 years down the line.
Yeah.
Interrupting the pattern, I think.
Yeah.
You could, I'd be so curious to see what happens after they leave the facility and so on. But let's not speculate too far into the speculative fiction, of course. I might bring us to our final question, which is, of course, we have to talk about the concluding chapters of the novel, in particular, where the audience learns about Esther's drowning, her death that led to the cryogenic freezing, and so on. We are so curious about your perspective on this and understand if you just want to leave this ambiguous, but can you comment on how much of this was accidental versus intentional, keeping in mind Esther was not in a great mental space at the time that this happened?
I think so, again, that ending is, I never quite knew. It took a long time to work out how did she get into that facility. That was one of the driving kind of workloads of writing the book. And it only came right at the end when originally I think I had it that she volunteered to go in. And one of my early readers, a wonderful writer called Tegan Bennett Daylight, said, I think this woman loves those kids so much. She would never volunteer, even fight for financial gain or for any reason to do something, to be taken away. And I thought, what a perceptive idea. So, and then I guess partly a little bit informed by Plath's life. She ended her life, and when her body was found, the manuscript for Ariel, I think, was sitting on her desk. So, it's very tragic. I don't see Esther's act, which was, partly self-destructive, but I don't think she intended to die. I don't think it was a suicidal act. But I certainly think that she was in a very dark place, and in that moment, she enabled a scenario that killed her. But yeah, I'd be interested to know what you both felt about that. Whether you thought it was purposeful.
I didn't think it was purposeful, but it seems, like you said, self-destructive, and she wasn't sort of in the space to realize that she was taking a risk there.
Yeah, I was similar. I didn't think of it as a clearly intentional decision on her part, but I'm also mindful that when people are at a point where they might be starting to think about ending their life, they might not necessarily have clear thoughts and clear plans about what they're going to do. Sometimes people engage in what's called suicide rehearsal behavior, where they might start acting in ways that are more impulsive or not with as much caution as they might normally do. And depending on the scenario, sometimes that can be fatal. It just might not have been intentional at the time. So I think perhaps, my interpretation was that she was in that point where she was not deciding to end her life, but was perhaps in this more ambiguous space about wanting to live versus wanting to die. But I wasn't sure. That was why I wanted to ask you what your intention was there.
What you've just described is so articulate, and I think it's really, that would be how I would be positioning what you did as well. Makes sense.
Yeah, what made me sad, I think, when the reveal happened about her last day was the interaction she had with Claire, and then reflecting on how Grace said, whatever happened to you really screwed my mom up. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can so see what happened in Claire's mind in that, afterwards. Yeah.
She feels responsible for the mother's death.
Yeah.
And sort of passes that on in the generations. I think one of the other redemptive qualities that we haven't mentioned is also, so there's that redemptive element between Grace and Esther, but also the fact, for better or worse, I don't know how much this surfaces in the book, but the fact that her poetry gets picked up and is clearly successful in its own right, even if she didn't get to see that, I think is a sort of, a positive to come from her death.
Yeah, I think this is not said in the book, but I like the idea of sort of maybe John Paul or her mom picking up that manuscript and thinking this is actually really good and pursuing that publication.
Yes, definitely.
It's almost like a legacy piece, the success that she didn't see in her own life, but knowing that, how many of us get to see what impact you had in the years beyond your death? Like it's not a common thing it's impossible really with the current state of the world, but it was nice to see like, oh, okay, well, I did make a difference. Yeah. It makes me think almost of, there's an episode of Doctor Who a very famous episode where they take Van Gogh to see the impact he made and, a gallery of his work. And, it made me cry so much when I watched it. Seeing him.
It's actually true with artists, isn't it? That they're often famous beyond their lifetime. So I can imagine the impact of that.
The quote that actually came to my mind is that line from Hamilton about how a legacy is planting a seed in a garden that you will never see.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's sort of lovely that Esther gets to actually see her legacy, both, in the positive one in terms of the poetry, but also Grace.
I think we haven't spoken much about Grace, but just in sort of like a little note on her, I took a lot of delight from her too, because although she might say like, I had a hard time with my mum, who's Esther's daughter, I think she's such a robust human in the world, I think, and sort of jolly and a doer and, is very capable. And so I think there's sort of a redemptive quality to her, the way that she's forged ahead. And she doesn't have the brittleness of Esther at all, I don't think. She's much more sort of forthright and capable.
Yeah, and you have to be, I think, to live with bodies for years and years, and look after all these people, and then make that decision in the end that what they were under my care. I can do, I can make the best call for them.
In that sense, I often think that Grace has an opportunity there that perhaps Vivian, who really fought against or felt constrained by her choices and then chose to leave Esther and so on, and Esther, who kind of tries to do the right thing and then can't. Grace has a much, much more agency. She makes a decision. She does what she thinks is the right thing. And then when it's no longer the right thing, she makes a new choice. And so in that way, I also feel that she has, if each generation improves on the last, then she's in much better shape, I would say, than the others.
On that note, I think we might wrap up our questions for today. Thank you so much, Alice, for joining us and for taking us on this journey through your thought processes behind the books and the complex generations that we've got covered in If You Go. It was absolutely wonderful having you on the show.
It was so lovely to talk to you. Thank you both so much.
Thank you once again to Alice for that wonderful conversation. Of course, we will put her book and author recommendations up on our website, as well as more information about If You Go. And that wraps us up for today. Thank you so much for listening.
If you like us, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. As we said at the top of this episode, we'd love your feedback in whatever way that is convenient for you. We can be found on nobblefeelings.com or on Instagram, The Storygraph. Thank you so much for listening.
All right. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Bye.